a wife from there. And then when he blessed him, he charged him, saying, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan." And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Padan Aram. So Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac, and Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. So what's going on here in this chapter? Well, first of all, I want to tell you something interesting, that we're kind of starting a new part, if you will, of Genesis. Because from here on out, from chapter 28, really through the end of Genesis, which is chapter 50, so the next 22 chapters, I guess, are truly Jacob's story. We have studied, Adam and Eve, and then Noah, Cain, obviously, and Abel, and then Noah, and then Abraham and Isaac. And now 28 through 50, this is really Jacob's story. The rest of the chapter, the rest of the book, I guess, is really Jacob's story. You see his trials with Laban in chapters 28, 29, 30, and 31. His trials with Esau in chapters 32 through 33. And then his trials with his sons, chapters 34 through 50. And that's the story of Joseph, obviously, is actually a part of Jacob's history. And that story begins in 37. So just kind of an interesting aside here, an interesting introduction to what we have now come to as far as this part of Genesis. So what's happening in 28 is something that actually began in 27. Remember in 27, if you look at verse 42 of chapter 27, this story here in 28 begins in 27:42, where in verse 42, "Now when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her younger son Jacob and sent to him, 'Behold, your brother Esau is consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you.'" So in 42 through 45, Rebekah began to expedite the plan which she had already formulated in her mind. Obviously, the real reason that Rebekah engineered Jacob's departure from home was to avoid the anger of Esau, which we saw at the end of chapter 27. But her excuse that she wanted Jacob to find a godly wife is kind of the pretense that she used to suggest to her husband Isaac. Esau's worldly wives were causing trouble in the home, as is always the case when God's people marry outside of God's will. So Rebekah would arrange for Jacob to spend time with her brother Laban, far from Esau, and so she began to kind of pave the way for Jacob's escape. First, she prepared Jacob for his departure in verses 42 and following of chapter 27 by explaining the need for it. And then her reason was just a few days would be needed for things to settle down. And she even said that in verse 44 of 27. But instead, as we know, as we have been reminded, it would be 20 years before Jacob would ever come back. And that, it appears, that is his return was after she died. So Jacob never did get to see his mother again. Once again, faith is living without scheming. And I think we all need to heed the warnings of James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, where he says, instead of saying, I'm going to do this and this and that, we need to say, if God wills. Because we need to recognize and remember what our lives are before God. And that is a smoke, basically, that is here today and gone tomorrow. And so it's just a good appreciation of that. And I know, as we're kind of getting into this chapter, I know that when we looked at Genesis 26, we introduced Isaac or that chapter, we said that was the only chapter in Genesis 26, that is dedicated solely to Isaac. And at that time, when we looked at chapter 26 a few weeks back, we kind of portrayed him, or we learned about him, that he is a picture of more of an ordinary Christian. But as we learn more about Isaac in chapter 27, and now even here in chapter 28, I think I am becoming more inclined to think of him as more of a lackadaisical Christian. Isaac, I think, is more of a picture of a lethargic Christian. He's a picture of someone who has faith, no doubt. Hebrews 11 tells us of Isaac's faith. He has faith, but he never does anything with his faith. He never tries to walk with God. He never tries to improve his walk with God and really grow in his faith. And what he seems to do as far as doing the right things, like even the blessing of, the passing of the blessing, he seems to do it too little, too late, and only when forced by God. You realize that, right? That even though he knew that the blessing would belong to Jacob, he still has full intention of outwitting God. Now, let that sink in for just a moment. Isaac has full intention and a plan, a secret plan, as we saw in 27, of outwitting God and allowing his flesh and his appetite to drive the passing of the blessing to Esau, his favorite son, because he was his favorite son. And so, yes, he does the right thing in the end. He actually blesses Jacob, but he doesn't bless him because he wants to, but because God forced his hand, didn't he? And so he does the right thing, but only when he's forced to do so by God. And the problem with doing the right thing when you're forced to do so is that you tend to forego the blessings that come with doing the right thing when you choose to do so. When you choose to do the right thing, God's blessings come with that choice. When you're forced to do the right thing, you forgo those blessings and instead bring on a lot of unnecessary and unneeded pain on yourself and many of those around you. And so let's kind of dive in and look at the first 5 verses here. Here we see that Isaac is intentionally passing down the covenant to the right son, but oh, so late. He's intentionally passing down the covenant to the right son here, but oh, so late. I don't know if he's realizing here that he's being manipulated by Rebekah or not. But the facts of Jacob's need to marry and of his renewed recognition of God's sovereignty push him to kind of reorient his position toward the covenant that he was just trying to hijack to his personal taste and favoritism. Before Jacob departed, Isaac gave him the pure and legitimate blessing. Here, Isaac is truly blessing Jacob for Jacob. In 27, he gave Jacob the blessing, but the whole time he was thinking he was blessing Esau. So as far as Isaac was concerned, he was blessing Esau in 27. In 28, he's actually passing the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob, knowingly, willingly, intentionally. That's the difference here. Now there's no holding back. Isaac specifically passed to Jacob the blessing of God that God had given to Abraham and Isaac. Isaac reiterated the blessings from God Almighty, El Shaddai, pertaining to prosperity and the land. And he urged his son to go to Padan by intermarriage Canaanites. Spiritual purity should be maintained in all generations. And so what is he doing? How is he actually intentionally passing down the covenant to the right son so late? Well, the first thing he does is he is charging Jacob not to intermarry with the Canaanites at the age of 77. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands in this audience, those of you who are 77. And I'm also not going to ask those of you who are 77 to tell me what kind of parental guidance you're receiving at this point in your life right now. But I would imagine not much, if any, because you hopefully already know a few things about life. Here, Jacob is receiving parental guidance on marriage from his father for the first time that we can see from the text explicitly at the age of 77. You see what I mean by saying that Isaac is being intentional, but oh so late? Too little, too late? The way that this instruction is given here in this text leads quite a few theologians to conclude that neither Jacob nor Esau had ever previously been taught that marriage to a Canaanite woman would be inconsistent with the will of God and unsatisfactory to their parents. Yeah, in chapter 26, at the end of 26, verses 34 and 35, we do read about Esau's marriage to the two Canaanite women about 30 years prior to this, right? And we do read that that marriage brought a lot of grief to Isaac and Rebekah, but there was nothing stated prior to that about the fact that maybe Esau knew this particular command that we read about here in 28. By the way, in case you're wondering, in the back of your minds, what's the big deal about marrying the Canaanites? Well, the Canaanites were a mixed breed. They incorporated dozens of groups and clans in their society, into their society by treaties and marriages. The family of Abraham would resist such mixing. The reason for marrying within the clan was a desire for maintaining purity of the line and being loyal to one's family. The surest way to lose tribal distinction was to intermarry with people of mixed elements. So Moses telling the Israelites again and again that their ancestors resisted marriage to the Canaanites certainly sounded like a note of warning. To marry Canaanites would destroy the purity of the line, to be sure. But here's the most important piece. Are you ready for this? To marry Canaanites would destroy the purity of the Israelites' faith. That's the main reason why it was so important not to intermarry with them. In case you're wondering, well, why in the world would make you say something like that? I have a really great example for you. If you think about it, what happened to Solomon? You remember what happened to Solomon? Solomon was kind of a Nepo baby. You know, he inherited the very strong kingdom that his father David had worked really hard and fought really hard to establish and solidify. And so Israel was an established and solidified a force to be reckoned with, a force that was recognized, a force that was respected, a nation that was certainly had its name and had its place and had its location and had a respect of a lot of nations around them. That's what Solomon inherited. And like a lot of those types of individuals that whose parents have done all the fighting and all the struggles and all the hard work, they don't really truly and fully appreciate the cost of all of that. And so what Solomon did was he thought that his contribution to enlarging the kingdom was by intermarrying. He would have concluded and conducted so many different treaties by taking on about 300 wives and about 700 concubines. He really, he was really a selfless man who did all that just to expand the kingdom. Not And so, what he, and think about this, what he had done. I mean, if that alone was not bad enough, that he had really taken on so much distraction from the main thing that he was to be, and that is point the nation to God. And instead, he had brought all of this into the kingdom. The biggest danger, the biggest issue, problem of what Solomon did was not only did he take on all these wives and concubines, but you know what else he did? He had brought in and welcomed into Israel all of their foreign gods and deities and idols and forms of worship. And he had thoroughly polluted the worship and the spiritual condition of Israel. In fact, here's what I mean by Solomon being a perfect example. It was after Solomon that the kingdom of Israel was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And it was Solomon that actually brought all that on. And all of the suffering. And so an argument could be made that all of the suffering, all of the spiritual apostasy, all of the idol worship, all of the captivities that Israel experienced after that, Babylonian captivity and all of the others, all of that could be argued, originated, and is dated back to what Solomon did with this horrible deviation from God's law and from worshiping one true God. So so that's the reason it was such a big deal back in Genesis 28, and this command was so important as far as not intermarrying with the Canaanites. So here, Isaac charges Jacob, again, at the age of 77. Where was Isaac, when these boys were 40 and Esau went off to marry the two Canaanites women? And so he charges him to not intermarry, and then he sending him away to find a wife from his mother's family. Again, as I already said, the timing, super strange, very late in the life of these two sons. And so that would mean that Jacob did not marry until he was 84. You remember the story of him going and meeting Rachel and basically falling in love with Rachel, being willing to work for her for 7 years. And when he had worked off the dowry for her for those 7 years for Laban, he got a taste of what he himself had practiced before, which is deception. And Laban deceived him and switched the two sisters. Rachel had an older sister named Leah, and Jacob did not recognize it until it was too late, that he had actually consummated his marriage with Leah and not Rachel. And then Laban basically gave him a choice that really was not a choice, to work 7 more years for Rachel as well. And so the marriage, really, initial marriage, did not happen until Jacob was 84, and then he worked another 7 years after that to work off the dowry for Rachel. And so very, very interesting here. Just a reminder, Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah, as was Esau when he took the two Canaanite wives for himself. So for Esau, this instruction in Genesis 28 came 37 years too late. See what I mean by being a little too late? Imagine his frustration at finally learning that the reason for his parents' grief about his marriage. So just very interesting to see how Isaac's words in verses 1 and 2 are too little and too late for Esau, and none too soon for Jacob. So, coupled with the fact that marriage was a secondary reason for Jacob's departure to Haran, while survival was his primary reason, I think this is kind of helping us to begin to grasp what I was trying to say early about Isaac truly being kind of a picture of a lackadaisical Christian. He had a very casual attitude towards the spiritual training of his sons. To him, these matters must have been of minimal importance to come as little and as late as they did. So it seems to me that Isaac here once again emerges as an example of what not to do. His absentee approach to functioning as the leader of his home, it kind of makes me think of all the terrible things that we're experiencing around us today, many, if not most of which are the outcomes of the absence of a strong father figure in the home. Just a very simple search, internet search, provided this, and most of you have probably already heard this or not. But did you know that the absence of a father at home results in higher rate of poverty and economic hardship for children? Single mother households are more likely to live in poverty than two-parent homes. Lack of financial stability affects housing, nutrition, healthcare access, and education opportunities for children. A lack of father at home also brings a lot of educational struggles for children. Children in father-absent homes are more likely to drop out of school, score lower on standardized tests, be suspended or expelled, and have lower educational attainment, is, of course, correlating with diminished upward mobility. Children in homes with no father also suffer from increased behavioral and emotional issues. They have elevated rates of aggression, anxiety, depression, and we wonder why our society today is so anxious and so depressed. Could it be that many, if not most, of our children come out of single parent, single mother homes? In elevated rates of low self-esteem and social withdrawal. Boys in particular may struggle with identity development and impulse control. Lack of father in home also is associated with higher involvement in crime and incarceration. Youth from father-absent homes, especially boys, are statistically more likely to join gangs, engage in violent behavior, be incarcerated, and there is also increased teen pregnancy and early sexual activity among the girls. Girls in father-absent homes are more likely to become sexually active at a younger age and are at greater risk for teen pregnancy and also less likely to delay childbearing or pursue long-term educational goals. There's a weaker intergenerational stability that is associated with lack of a father at home. The absence of a father figure can contribute to cycles of unstable relationships, single parenting across generations. It kind of continues over and over again, and struggles with trust and family cohesion. And by the way, the lack of father in home, it actually goes to all the way to community level consequences. Neighborhoods, this is interesting. I don't know if you ever realized this, but neighborhoods with high rates of father absence often see elevated crime and gang activity, reduced school performance at the district level, greater reliance on social safety nets, and weakened community institutions. If that wasn't bad enough, let's look closer to where we are. Let's consider Christian homes for a moment. Isaac's spiritually lazy and lackadaisical approach to the spiritual upbringing of his sons is very similar to the way Christian families approach it today. Many of the Christian homes today let the world, the school, and the church do the raising of their kids, and the results are nothing short of catastrophic. According to a 2022 report from Lifeway and Probe Ministries, 60% of U.S. Christians under the age of 40 say that salvation can be received through Jesus, Buddha, or Muhammad, when the Bible says that there is no other name by which man can be saved but Jesus Christ alone. 38% of Christians say Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. When the Bible says that the only reason that Jesus was crucified was because the Jews got very clearly the gist of what he was saying, and that is he was claiming to be God, because he is God. 37% of Christians believe that religious belief is just a matter of personal opinion and that it is not objective truth. If this is not objective truth, my friends, then we have no objective reality of how to live our lives. Everything is not absolute. Everything becomes basically just comparative and not absolute. 38% of Christians ages 18 to 25 believe that Jesus Christ was human and he committed sins just like you and me. Even though the Bible says that our salvation is based on the fact that Jesus Christ was born sinlessly and lived a sinless life. That's how he was able to die for the cross of the entire human race. But it's not just young people who believe this. 37% of Christians ages 43 through 58, 35% of Christians 27 through 42, and 35% of Christians ages 59 plus also hold the belief that Jesus was a normal guy and a sinner just like you and me. If you believe that Jesus was a normal guy and a sinner just like you and me, might as well throw this away, because this has no value, no part, and no effectiveness in our life here and life after death. Because you see, the whole principle of Christ's death and his resurrection is based on the fact that he lived a sinless life to die for the sins of the entire human race. So it's very interesting when we look at this to kind of recognize and to see ourselves in a sense in a mirror when we look at Isaac's life and his approach to life. And then what he is doing is he is restating the Abrahamic blessing, but in a more specific way. The blessing of Jacob is somewhat more positive now in chapter 28. While Isaac had blessed Jacob in the previous chapter, we already said he was actually thinking that he was blessing Esau. And so that blessing doesn't reach the clarity and the particularity of verses 3 and 4. In verses 3 and 4 of 28, he says, "May God Almighty bless you," and he knows it's Jacob now, "and make you, Jacob, fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of people. May he also give you the blessing of Abraham." So here he's passing the blessing of Abraham and Isaac to Jacob, to you, and to your descendants with you, that you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham. Only by allusion did Isaac convey the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob in chapter 27. Here, it is stated in very specific terms. Isaac had finally resigned himself to the fact that God is going to bless Jacob and not Esau. You know, I have read about Isaac many times and grew up learning about his life. However, what I never considered before starting to take a deeper dive for our sermon series is that Isaac almost seems to represent someone who is saved. But that's about it. He doesn't do much, if anything, to grow in the Lord. He doesn't pass on his knowledge to his children, and his life should serve as a stark reminder to all those people who think of Christianity as fire insurance, wanting to get saved in order to not go to hell, but still enjoy all the trappings of earth at the same time. Maybe in theory, this sounds like a good plan to them, but in practice, it's a terrible plan, full of unneeded pain and unnecessary sufferings, like Isaac's life. Much unneeded pain and unnecessary sufferings. And then verses 6 through 9, we get to Esau here, and Esau just doesn't get it. He doesn't. He continues to try to do it himself. Esau continues to try to do it himself. You know, we read a lot of books and we watch a lot of movies and shows, and we've kind of been conditioned to that, you know, in most of our stories, or at least until recently, you know, the bad guy is going to get what's coming to him and the good guy usually wins. And so as conditioned by those types of stories, we are kind of, sometimes when we come to this story, we think, well, Esau is going to get what he deserved. Esau gets what he deserved. But I want to remind you of something. I want to remind you what Paul writes in Romans chapter 9. In fact, just go ahead and keep one finger here and go to Romans chapter 9. And I just want to remind you what God revealed. And that's, by the way, the beauty of the Bible is that there is this idea of progressive revelation, right? We learn the rest of the story. We learn the different parts of the story, not just from the story itself in Genesis 27 or 28, but from Hebrews 11 and from Romans 9. We get little bits and pieces that kind of help us to see the full picture. That's how the Bible works. And in Romans 9, where Paul basically talks about, as I've told you, quite a few weeks, that Romans 9 through 11 is a part of the letter to the Romans where Paul tells them about, and us really, about the fact that God is not through with Israel. And so here in these three chapters, 9, 10, and 11, Paul is basically saying, hey, just because the church is God's vehicle through which to bless the world and God's spokespeople to the world, doesn't mean that God forever rejected Israel. God is not through with Israel. He set them aside for now. And they can certainly join what he's doing by becoming part of the church, much like my best friend in college who I grew up with, who was a Jewish individual and who, because of my witness to him, trusted Christ. And he is a Jew, but he's a saved Jew, and he's a Christian today, and he's a follower of his Messiah and my Messiah, and he's saved today because he joined God's current program in the world, which is through the church. And so all the Jews in the world can do that. But there will still be a time when God will, and the Bible clearly says, when God will reveal himself in such a way that it will be that all of the Jewish people who will be alive at that time will all be saved. Everyone who is alive, they will turn to him. And so God is not through with Israel. He has not rejected them. He has not replaced them, like so many churches mistakenly believe that the church replaced Israel. That's not true. 9 through 11, Paul clearly states that. But back to our story in verse 13 of chapter 9, just backing up a little bit, verse 10. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, I want you to listen to this. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose, according to his choice, would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. This is one of those things that for us as humans, it's hard for us to understand that. In fact, I'll go ahead and say it. It's impossible for us to fully understand that. And there's a piece and a part of us, if we're going to be completely honest with each other and with God, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't sound right that God would do something like that. But that's where we have to take a time out. Time out. And we have to reorient ourselves with regard to God. And we have to remind ourselves that time out. You see, I don't get to judge God by my standards of what's right and wrong, what's fair and not fair. But it's God's standards that override my standards. And I don't get to look at God and say, well, God, this just doesn't sound right. I just don't think that's fair that you did that. Instead, because I don't understand God, and I will never fully be able to understand him. But what I do know is that he's so much greater than me. And so instead, when I come to God, I come to him from the perspective of, if you did it, it's the right thing. And that which may seem wrong to me is only that way because of my, one, limitations. I am so much smaller and more limited than God. And two, because of my fallen nature. I was born in sin, just like all the rest of us. And so my limitations and my fallenness limit my ability and taint my ability to think objectively. So even at my best, I still cannot be fully objective. And even at that, my objectivity only is based on my perspective, and I have to yield and submit that to God. So all of that is to say, back to our story of the bad guys get what he wants. I don't want us to think that way about Esau, okay? Esau and the whole election, the way that this story played out. Esau is not a man who, because of his actions described here and elsewhere, was rejected by God. He is really not any different from any unbeliever whose heart has not been enlivened and whose mind has not been enlightened to respond to divine realities. Esau in his unbelief is no more depraved, nor any less sensitive to spiritual things than any other son or daughter of Adam who suffer from inherent sin. In fact, Paul writes in Romans chapter 3, there is none righteous, not even one. There's none who understands. There's none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There's none who does good, not even one. And so the question then comes up, did Esau know about not intermarrying with the Canaanites? While we may never know the exact answer to this, our present passage seems to suggest that Esau may not have known because Isaac was not a very good father. And by the way, that brings me to another point. Do you see how favoritism actually makes you a worse parent to everyone, including those you favor rather than a better parent? When you favor a child, you try to overlook their issues, problems, and sins rather than lovingly correcting them and pointing them to the Lord. A parent who practices favoritism like Isaac did with Esau ends up actually hurting his child by constantly rationalizing their child's behavior instead of helping the child to align his behavior with God. Here's the thing you got to realize with favoritism. You can't both train your child and practice favoritism. So by choosing the latter, you actually hurt your child by robbing him of the godly training you could have given him instead. And so here Esau tries to impress Isaac with his third marriage. Because Esau was favorited rather than trained by his father, Isaac, he seems to not have known about intermarrying with the Canaanites. 37 years too late, Esau has learned. Failing to see any problems in his actions, Esau took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael. This woman was not a Canaanite, but she was of the family of Abraham. But it's just kind of interesting how it works out here, because in the contrasting anticlimax, Esau, trying to please his father, married a descendant of Abraham through Ishmael. Ironically, the unchosen son of Isaac marries into the unchosen line of Ishmael. So Esau tried to better his marital reputation by marrying a third wife. He obviously had no understanding of the Abrahamic covenant and its purity. He was still living on the human level. Now you may think, and you may say to me, well, how can we blame Esau? If he wasn't chosen by God, what could he have possibly done? Well, the fact of the matter is we already have enough information about Esau leading up to this particular point to know that he was a man who was really kind of set on doing things himself instead of yielding to God. And so it's just interesting because even though we don't know all the ins and outs of God's choice and how that works, but we do know that Esau didn't seem to have spiritual interests. He didn't seem to value, for example, his birthright more than he valued a bowl or a lentil stew, right? So we know enough about him to know that he was kind of set on a fleshly way of doing things. And he seems to continue to attempt to earn his own place, right? And that's kind of what we see about him here. Here, as often in Genesis, this new step forward in the history of salvation is set against the backdrop of unscrupulous behavior by the patriarchs involved. Once again, it is God's mercy and not human merit that is the ultimate hope of redemption. And if you're leaving, as we're closing this passage today, if you're leaving today's message with some unanswered questions, I say, welcome to the club. The Bible is not set out to answer all the possible questions. That's what heaven is going to be for. When we get to heaven, we can get some of those questions hopefully answered. But for now, what the Bible is given to us for is for us to know how we should live. And I think we certainly learned that from the passage today. And I think the big idea that the first 9 verses of Genesis have kind of communicated to us is when you do the right thing too little too late because God forces you instead of freely choosing it, you often forego the blessings that come with it. That's, I think, the biggest lesson that we see. When you do the right thing too little too late because God forces you instead of freely choosing it, you often forego the blessings that come with it. Isaac could have had the blessing of growing older in the last 43 years of his life, having both of his sons living near him. He could have had the blessings of seeing his grandsons. He could have had the blessings of a peaceful interaction with his wife and a trust and love at home. But instead, both of his sons left the home to where the last really 43 years of his life, he saw them very sporadically and very little. He didn't get to see the birth of his grandsons. He didn't get the trust of his wife, and his relationship with his wife was very estranged. And those are just some of the few details of the unnecessary pain and suffering that Isaac brought into his life when he did the right thing because God forced him to do it and not because he chose to do it. Hopefully we can learn from that as we do from all the places and parts and stories of the Bible, sometimes of what to do and sometimes of what not to do. And certainly today's story is not an exception to that. Let's bow our heads. Father, as we come